All right. Well, good evening again, everyone, and thank you for being here tonight. This is our second November Think and Drink. Um, and I will talk about a couple of upcoming events at the end of this, so just stick around for that. But tonight, I don't want to speak too long. Um, for folks who don't know me, my name's Alyssa Zabrowski, and I am the current president of the Coastal Master Naturalists Association. So thank you again for being here. And tonight we're welcoming Andrea Grabman. Andrea or Andrea? I should have double checked that before I announced your name. Oh, you might be
There
on
we, I
mute.
think it was on mute for me. It's Andrea. Thank you for
And okay.
asking.
Yeah, no problem. People say my name wrong too, so I feel the pain. Andrea Grabman, she's a new hire with the Charleston County Parks and Rec. She started in the spring of 2024, so not quite a year yet, but she is here tonight and she is going, or I'm sorry, she has an MS in Marine Environmental Sciences from SUNY Stony Brook University. Her master's thesis was titled An Investigation of the Outcome of Remediation Efforts of a Superfund Site, trace metal levels in the water column and in Calcinectes sapidus, blue crab. I probably butchered that first name.
It's okay.
Um, Based in Foundry Cove, New York. So thank you for being here tonight. She also has a BS in marine biology from the College of Charleston. And then more recently, she has worked on research projects with U.S. Forest Service, the College of Charleston, and then again at Stony Brook University. She's been involved in policy with the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. And prior to joining CCPRC, Andrea taught science on board the USS Yorktown, so that's pretty cool. She was previously an interpretive ranger at Edisto Beach State Park and managed the Environmental Learning Center out at the state park. And the bulk of her work has been in environmental education and outreach. She's worked at a variety of different nature centers. And then actually in the spring of 2024, she graduated the Coastal Master Naturalist group. So
Yay.
congratulations. She's going to talk to us tonight about one of her favorite activities, beachcombing. And before she gets started, I did want to make sure that folks kind of changed up their screen view just a little bit because she's going to be showing us some pictures in her presentation. So if you see in the top right corner, you'll see view. If you click on that and click speaker view, that will highlight Andrea, and then you'll be able to more easily see her presentation. It'll be like a bigger view of the presentation. But of course, if you run into any trouble, feel free to shoot a message in the chat and I can try to help you out while she's presenting. And with that, I will pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alyssa. I appreciate that. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Nikki, for asking me to present tonight. This is my first ever Think and Drink, so I'm very excited to be here. That's partly because I did just finish the CMNA program this past spring, but it's also partly because, to be perfectly honest, this is witching hour at my house. So hopefully I will not be interrupted by any goblins running around. There might be the four-legged goblin that makes an appearance, but that one's a lot less disruptive, so we'll tolerate that one. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. And let's see here. Oop. Hold on, I'm having some issues with my let me try my display settings here just a second. Boop, boop, boop. Okay, 1 minute. I have to just pull up this. Okay. Can everybody see the screen okay? Yes, thumbs up. Okay, and everybody can hear me. Okay. So I am intending this presentation to be very interactive. So I have a series of slides, and I also have some examples of things on the slides that I plan to show you. My camera's kind of up high, so when I'm showing you these things, sorry if I'm kind of looking towards the ceiling, but it's the only way I can kind of work this out with this format. So I do like to call this presentation a shell story. As coastal master naturalists, you may recognize that that's a nod to Dr. Richard Porcher. Here's a bit of the interactive part because, as he says, every plant
That's a story.
Hey, tells a story. Every plant tells a story. In the same way, every shell tells a story as well. sometimes when I'm beachcombing with a group, people don't always necessarily realize or recognize the fact that the shells were made by animals. So my job tonight is to tell the shell story. So we're going to talk about a lot of the animals that we will commonly find on our beaches here. We are not going to be able to talk about all of the animals on our beaches because that would just be far too many and there's not enough time in the evening for that. So we're going to stick with the more common finds. And we're going to start with the phylum Mollusca. So soft-bodied animals that have a mantle and a shell. And mollusks do comprise 23% of all marine species. So if you're beachcombing, you have a really good chance of finding a mollusk on the beach. And what I have here are a variety of mollusks that would be found in our waters. Now, I do include some cephalopods on the screen, not because we would necessarily find them on our beaches. You might, but because I think it was really important to include them when we're talking about mollusks in general. So if we start at the bottom middle of the screen, you'll see a common Atlantic octopus. And then in the top left-hand corner, you see a brief squid. Now, you may have just picked up on the fact that I said, well, mollusks have shells. Well, sometimes mollusks don't have shells, as is the case with the octopus. They lost their shells, through an evolutionary perspective. But then the brief squid actually does have a remnant of a shell. Squids have that shell inside their body. It's called a pen. And it's just, kind of like a shell remnant that's inside. In the top middle of the screen, we'll see a knobbed whelk. And what I'm going to do is talk a lot more extensively about whelks and the other snails. But if you look at the bottom left, beside the octopus, you'll see another mollusk that doesn't have a shell. That's a type of a nudibranch called a sea hare. A nudibranch is a type of sea slug. So again, a mollusk that doesn't have a shell, but if we're thinking in a terrestrial manner, slugs on land don't have shells, and the snails do. So the nudibranch and the knobbed whelk are gastropods, and we're going to be going into that. And then on the right-hand side, just another of the common mollusks that we see, we're going to be talking about bivalves, so mollusks that have a hinged shell. All right. I'm going to start with the whelks, the Bucicon whelks, because these are pretty common snails that you're going to find on our beaches. Now, sometimes I'll say, I'll start to talk about whelks and I'll immediately have somebody say, wait a minute, my whole life I've called that a conch. What is a conch? Well, a conch is like a relative of the whelk. I like to tell people it's like the whelk's cousin. We may sometimes find a conch on our beaches here, a Florida horse conch, but conchs are not common in our waters. You're going to find them a little further south of here in warmer waters. I know I said that I was going to stick with common species on our beaches, but I do have an example of a conch with me just because I think it's kind of fun to look at. But this is an example of a queen conch that I did find on a beach down in the Bahamas. You can see there's a hole in it, so I know that somebody fished the animal. So that's an example of a conch. And if I'm going to compare it to a whelk, here's a knobbed whelk. It's a rather large knobbed whelk. Can everybody see these examples okay? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, they're good. They're good.
Okay, good. All right, let's set these down here. So if you look at the whelk on the bottom of the screen, you'll notice it's kind of turned over on its side. And it has a little brown circular part there. That's called its operculum. And the operculum is like a trap door. And when the animal is inside its shell, it is a type of snail that can pull its whole body into its shell. And that's kind of important because we're going to talk about some snails that can't do that. But when it pulls its whole body inside, it can close that trap door, that operculum, and it can kind of keep itself protected from predators, and it keeps itself from being desiccated or drying out. Now, what we have on the bottom screen is a knobbed whelk, and on the top left-hand side of the screen, we have something called a lightning whelk. Now, you might notice that there's two other words on the screen, dextral and sinestral. And that has to do with what's called the handedness of the snail. So any knobbed whelk that you will find will always open on the right-hand side. That's called a dextral snail. Now, what you see over on the left-hand side of the screen is a lightning whelk. And we know it's a lightning whelk because it opens on the left-hand side. It's a sinestral snail. And I have some examples here with me. I did have some examples here with me. Where did my lightning whelk just disappear to? Oh no. Ah. Oh wait, here it is. It's small. It's hiding. It's hiding from me. So if I'm holding these up to the camera, my right hand will fit into the side of a knobbed whelk, and my left hand will fit into the side of a lightning whelk. So you can see they have opposite sides to open. Aside from that, they look fairly common, but it is very uncommon overall to have left-handed snails. So there are a few other varieties in the world, but you're not going to find other varieties here in our waters. And it actually is advantageous for the snail to have a left-handed opening because apparently it deters crabs from predating on the shell. So a lot of crabs will apparently pick with the right claws, and they have difficulty eating a left-handed opening snail. So kind of interesting. All right, so again, here's our knobbed whelk. Now, what you see on the top right-hand side of the screen is one of the whelk egg cases. And I have an example of that as well. You'll notice that at the very tip of it, the top tip of it is very tapered. So when the whelk lays its egg cases, that part is the part that's usually attached down into the sand. Sometimes it becomes loose, and so you'll see the egg case that kind of floats up onto the beach. Now, if it's very limber, if it's moving around, then it might have some baby whelks that are developing in there. And if you want to, you can pick it up and toss it back in the water. If it's like hard and dry like these, if it's kind of rattling around, then that's an egg case that's just dried up at this point. So the whelks will lay their egg cases, and the babies will develop inside of here. And you can tell if it's a hatched egg case because in each of these little pods, trying to bring it down a little bit for the camera, you'll see a little hole, and that's where the whelk hatches out from. Now, when it hatches, it looks very similar to the adult. In fact, it's about the size of the tip of the shell right here. Now, it has an interesting name. When it hatches, it's actually called a protoconch. And I know I just said these are not conchs, these are whelks, but that is just the name. When it hatches, the size of that shell is called a protoconch. Sometimes you can actually see that the tip of a whelk shell is a slightly different color than the rest of the shell, and you can tell that's where, that's how large it was when it hatched. So what the whelk does is as it grows, it adds on to this part of the shell here called the lip, and it secretes calcium carbonate and proteins from its mantle. And that's how the shell forms. So it kind of winds around itself and gives it this unique shape. Now, a lot of times people say, well, how in the world does it do that? Well, something cues it. It has these cues that allows it to grow in spurts or increments. And so these are called the growth varices, and that's what gives it this kind of unique shape. So nobody knows exactly how it cues itself, but it's something, when its neurons will cue, and it will start to develop. So these are animals they do have to eat. It loves to eat bivalves, things with two shells like clams. And so what it will do is it will insert this part of the lip into the side of a clam. It will start to pry the clam open. And then it uses its scraping tongue called a proboscis to eat the meat inside. When it is alive, it walks around on one foot, just like a terrestrial snail that has a siphon that comes out the front, has a pair of antennae. So it looks very similar to a land snail. All right, so we're going to move on. We have a couple other snails here. On the left-hand side, we have a channeled whelk. And on the right-hand side, it's just two different images of a pear whelk. The channeled whelk, this is actually my favorite. It looks like kind of like an ice cream cone. It's very smooth. It has these smooth whorls around it. It's not going to have these spikes that stick out like a knobbed whelk. By the way, if you ever hear the term Keener's whelk, that is simply a knobbed whelk. Sometimes people use that term locally, especially up in like North Carolina. You may hear Keener's whelk more often. It's just a form of knobbed whelk with long spines, but a knobbed whelk essentially. So this one does not have the spines. Now the pear whelk, you'll notice on the screen, is a little more bulbous. It kind of has an onion bulb shape at the top. So that's one way to tell the difference between the two. All right, a lot of more snails here. So on the top left, we have a moon snail. It's also called a shark's eye or a tiger's eye. And if you ever find a shell on the beach that has this perfect little hole that looks like somebody drilled into it, and it almost looks like you could put it on a string and make a necklace out of it, that is because the moon snail went ahead and ate that animal. So moon snails, like the whelks, have a scraping tongue, but their scraping tongue also acts as a drill. It's called a radula, and they are pretty ferocious, actually. So when they find their prey, their foot will increase to 4 times its normal size. It will envelope the prey, and then it will use this drill called the radula to drill inside. It actually secretes a type of hydrochloric acid in the process. Sometimes will take days to drill inside its prey, and then it slowly will slurp out the innards. So that is your moon snail, very common find on our beaches. In the top center, we have a couple more moon snails, but they're lying next to a lettered olive, which is our state shell. Olives are just another type of snail, but it's called a lettered olive because it looks like somebody went ahead and drew lines on its body. So depending on the way you look at it, it could be W's or it could be M's, depending on the way you turn the shell. So here are some lettered olives right here. Now, when you pick up a lettered olive, you'll see that the shell is very, very smooth versus a whelk that kind of has a rough shell to it. And that's because when this animal comes out of the shell, its whole mantle will cover it. And so the mantle almost polishes the shell and it gives it this nice, really smooth shape to it. These are a good find if you're coming to the Beach Walk Friday at Beach Walker, that's a great place to find lettered olives. Sometimes you'll see what looks like little mole tracks through the sand. And if you dig them up, you'll see the body, the mantle, it's kind of gray, sometimes kind of spotted, and it will slowly pull its whole body back into its shell. So that is our state shell right there. And then on the very right-hand side, we have a banded tulip. So that tulip is just another type of snail. There are true tulips and then there's banded tulips. They're very similar. They're both called spindle snails because if you look at the top and the bottom of those shells, they're kind of skinny with a bulbous part in the middle. So if you can think of like a spindle. And then if we go around to the very bottom of the screen, we have an auger. So kind of like a drill. If you're thinking of a drill, that's an auger. And then under the moon snail, you'll see something that looks almost like a gelatinous piece of sand. And that is actually a moon snail collar. That's one of my favorite things to find on the beach. And what that is the egg case that the moon snails will lay. It almost looks like a cardboard shirt collar. So if you have items that are dry cleaned and you take out that cardboard shirt collar, that's what it looks like you're finding on the beach. It looks like trash, honestly. But what the moon snail will do is secrete mucus and it sticks sand grains together with the mucus and then it will lay eggs in those layers. And then the moon snails will hatch from that collar. So sometimes we may be lucky and we find a moon snail collar. All right. So at this point, I am going to show you a really fun video that I found. I am going to, hopefully it will work. I'm going to escape from here and bring it up. but it's a video of a moon snail eating, and it's just phenomenal. So, oops, come on, mouse. All right, so hopefully everybody will be able to hear this. If you can't, please let me know. The sound takes a minute. Oop. I'm not getting any sound. Are y'all getting sound? No, okay. Well, I'm just going to tell you what's happening. So there is a moon snail that is intending to eat a cockle. You can still hear me, right? Yeah, okay.
We
It's
can still
intending
hear you.
to eat. I'm sorry.
We can still hear you. Yep.
Okay, perfect. I'll just narrate it. It's intending to eat a cockle, and so it has this large foot that it's increasing in size. And the cockle at first is going to detect it, and it's going to jump away. So that is the large foot of the cockle, and it's going to try to jump away from the moon snail. But these moon snails they're pretty aggressive creatures. It's going to burrow under the sand in this video, and it's going to find a cockle that is hidden under the sand. So there you can see a siphon of the cockle, and cockle is going to try to escape, but the moon snail has it in its grasp. I mean, this just amazes me. And it's going to cover the moon snail. It's going to suffocate it with its foot, essentially. And then it will sit there and drill into the side of the shell and have its little clam slurpee. All right, that's the gist of it. So,
Is that sped up or real time?
as far as I can tell, it's real time.
Wow.
I know, it's pretty wild. All right, so let me escape from here and go back to the presentation. I thought that's going to be a really fun video for us. And again, I just have to change my settings here. Okay. All right. So a few more gastropods, a few more snails. On the left, we have a baby's ear. And I have an example of a baby's ear here. It's called that because it does look like a teeny tiny little ear. Now, the cool thing about baby's ears is that the snail cannot draw its whole body into its shell. So if you ever find one, it's going to look like a big blob of mucus, honestly, sitting there. It can partially draw itself in, but it's never going to be able to fit its whole body into this tiny little shell. And then on the right-hand side, we have some slipper snails. They're called slipper snails because they almost look like a little slipper that maybe a little elf could wear or something on its foot. And slipper snails have an interesting lifestyle. So their scientific name is Crepidula fornicata. And what they will do is they will stack themselves on top of each other. Now, the large one, they all start off as male. The large one at the bottom will become a female. So they're hermaphroditic. And the one on top will be the male. Now, another one will come along and stack itself on top of that male. And then that one will turn into a female snail. So you'll see them piggybacking on top of each other. Now, somebody recently said, well, what happens if they unstick each other? And I said, I don't really know the answer to that. So I'm not sure what happens if they come apart. If, this one changes back into the male or if it then lives the rest of its life as female. I don't know the answer to that. All right, we're going to move on to the bivalves. So things with two hinges. On the top left, we have a giant Atlantic cockle. I like to tell kids these are what mermaids wear. These are the mermaid shirts. But you have the giant Atlantic cockle. They almost have a tooth-like projection that sticks down here from the top, and that's important. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. Now, on the right-hand side, you'll see another cockle. That's a strawberry cockle. It's a smaller variety. Of course, you can't always tell a shell based on its size because they are going to start out small and get larger over time. But we have a giant Atlantic cockle, a strawberry cockle, and then underneath we have our arc shells. And there's a whole bunch of different types of arc shells. You can see this one has a hole that's in the very back, so that's because a moon snail ate it. But those are arcs. Now, to tell the difference between a cockle and an arc, you're going to look right here where the hinge is. And like I said, the Atlantic cockle is going to have a tooth-like projection that sticks down versus the arc. If you run your finger right along the arc shell, you'll feel like piano keys. So a whole bunch of little grooves there. So that's one way to tell the difference between them. And then in the middle of the screen on the bottom, we have what's called a kitten paw, so like a little cat paw. And then on the very left-hand side, I'm dropping it here. One of my favorite shells. It's called a spiny jewel box. So it almost looks like a tiny little jewel box, I suppose, when it was closed up together, like a little jewelry case. So your spiny jewel box. All right, some more common finds on our beach. On the very left, we have a quahog or a clam. Now, the difference between an arc, we just talked about the arcs a minute ago, and a quahog, one of the ways to tell them apart is the vein or the ribbing. So you see for an arc shell, there's ribbing that comes down along the sides like this versus a quahog, which is going to have ribbing kind of going across the shell in this manner. So the reason I have a picture of the top and the bottom of the quahog is because the quahogs, their scientific name is Mercenaria mercenaria. And the reason is because American Indians at one point used to carve out that purple part of the shell. That purple part is where the adductor muscle was that held the clam together. And the purple area was carved out and turned into beads that were called wampum. And wampum was traded amongst the American Indians. And then when the Europeans came over here, it was turned into a form of currency. So at one point in time, it was actually used as currency in the colonies. So that's why it has the name Mercenaria mercenaria to this day. So pretty interesting little fact. Also oyster shells. And I am very remiss. I forgot to put an oyster shell up on my screen. We can also talk about oysters, but sometimes you'll see the bottom of the oyster shell also has that purple spot to it. That's where the adductor muscle was. All right. Then we have a stout tagalus that's on the top right. On the bottom, with the little hole in the shell, the bottom right, we have a channeled duck clam. I chose that image purposefully because it does have a hole in the shell, and that's because the channeled duck clam is extremely fragile, and oftentimes when you find it on the beach, you will find just remnants of it. So this is an animal that's going to live offshore, where it's a calmer environment, and so therefore these animals can have these, more thin, fragile shells. But when they're washed up onto the beach, you're typically not going to find one whole like this. You're going to find them in fragments. And then in the middle, you have what's called a tellin. And here's an example of a tellin. Again, it has a little hole in it, so it's been eaten by a moon snail. All right, and just, again, mollusks are so very prevalent on our beaches. The top is a stiff pen shell. It's called a pen shell because it looks like a feather quill that somebody may have ridden with at one point. You'll see that part of it has mother of pearl on it, that very beautiful shiny area. So if you ever see mother of pearl jewelry, it's, comes from different mollusks. On the right-hand side, we have an angel wing. And I have an example of an angel wing here. This is a true angel wing. I also have a false angel wing. So the false angel wings, they tend to be a little smaller, but they also don't have this area of the shell that folds over onto itself. So a little bit different. And if you think of a pair together, I guess it would look like, angel wings. On the bottom right, we have our coquinas or our butterfly clams. Those are all those beautiful colored little clams that you see on the beach. When the tide goes out in the swash zone, you'll see them burrowing down into the sand. The middle picture at the bottom, we have our jingle shells, so named because if you take a pair of them and you click them together in your hands, sounds like a bunch of little coins jingling. So sometimes they're, black, sometimes they're kind of this orangish color, sometimes they're more pink. A lot of times that has to do with what sediment that they were in. And then on the bottom left, we have a calico scallop shell. So scallops are pretty interesting animals. They have a reduced foot. So a lot of clams have a pretty strong foot, but scallops have a very reduced foot. And all along the edge of the shell, with it opened up, you would see a row of eyes. They have these beautiful blue eyes. They're actually eye spots, but they are eyes, and they can swim. So they will use kind of a form of like propulsion. They'll clap their shells together and force water outside the back of the shell, and that allows them to swim around. So it's pretty fun to watch them swim. All right, so we're going to move on to a new phylum, the echinoderms, Echinodermata. And they are called this because these are our spiny skinned or our spiky skinned animals. And these are common ones that you would find on our beaches here. So on the left, we have an urchin. Underneath the urchin, you will see the inside part of the urchin. It's called the test. So that is what the shell will look like under the spines. In the top picture where you see all the spines, you'll see right in the middle is where its mouth would be. So the picture of the test has the animal flipped over, and that hole is where it would excrete waste. So that is an urchin. And then the top middle picture is called a splendid sea cucumber. That's a common find on our beaches. They don't tend to be very large. And they do have spines, although their spines are a little smaller. They're not as stiff as obviously like an urchin. So we do have a couple varieties of sea cucumbers that we find on our beaches. On the very right-hand side, you'll see a lined sea star. Under it, you'll see a common sea star, also known as the Forbes sea star. And it's fairly easy to see that orange spot on the Forbes sea star. That is called the madreporite. And the madreporite is the area that the animal can pull water into itself. And if you flip the sea star over, you would see it has a bunch of little suction cup feet called tube feet. And by pulling water into its body, it allows those tube feet to essentially work. So it's going to pull that water in and it's going to push out those tube feet, and that's how it walks around. Sea stars do have eyes. They have an eye at the tip of each of the arms. It's also fairly easy to see that on the common sea star. You'll see a tiny little spot at the end of each of the arms there. Now, in the middle of the sea star is the central disc, and if the animal does lose its arms, it can regenerate as long as it has part of its central disc there. So if you cut a sea star in half, that sea star can regenerate arms because it has part of that central disc in place. And what we have at the bottom of the screen is our keyhole urchin or the sand dollar. And I have an example of one right here. So another one that's fairly easy to find out at Beach Walker. Now, oftentimes people will ask, why in the world does it have all those holes on the shell? And the answer is nobody knows. But it's thought that the animals will kind of anchor themselves in the sand, and the water can pass through, and it may help to keep the animal from flipping over. That being said, they can walk. So if this were alive, it would look like the one on the screen. It would be covered with a bunch of little spines on it, and it will push itself along using those spines. Now, in the middle, is where the mouth is. So just like the sea star or the urchin, you can see that urchin's mouth on the top side, the top right or top left-hand picture. It has a mouth right there in the middle. Sea cucumber is a little different. It has a mouth at one end of its body and not the other. There's a whole legend with a sand dollar that if you break it open, you'll see what looks like doves inside. Those doves are the animal's teeth. So when the teeth are together, they form a very cool structure called the Aristotle's lantern. And it almost looks like an old-timey lantern that you would carry along. So fun little sand dollar fact. And then if you look under the hole, you can see right below it, there's a teeny tiny little hole, and that's where the anus is. All right. We're going to move on to our arthropods. We're going to be talking about our crustaceans because oftentimes we will find molts of these animals on the beach. So all of the animals that we're talking about are invertebrates. So they're animals that do not have a backbone and they do not have internal bones. Instead, they have shells to protect their body parts. As you know, we were talking about the whelks earlier, and we mentioned the fact that the shell will, wrap around and grow with it. But with things like the crustaceans, they actually molt their body parts. So when they get too large or when they get to a certain size, they actually take off their shell. They kind of make themselves a little bit larger, they inflate, and that's when they're soft. That's what soft shell crab is. And then they will harden up, so they'll grow a new larger shell. So oftentimes we will find the molts of the crabs. The top crab is a blue crab. That's the one that I did my research on in grad school. It's called Calanectes sapidus, which means beautiful swimmer. Now, all crabs are decapods, which means they have 10 legs. That includes the pinchers at the front. But you can see with the blue crab, those back legs have been modified into swimming paddles, which is what gives it its name. Now, by looking at this blue crab, I can tell that it's a male blue crab, and that's because its claws are blue. A female blue crab will actually have red tips to her claws. I like to tell kids when I'm teaching them that it looks like she's painted her fingernails. So it's an easy way to tell them apart. If you were to flip the crab over, you could also look underneath and tell if it's a male or female based on what its apron looks like underneath. So a female will have a triangular shape after she's had eggs. It kind of bows out and it looks like the Capitol building. A male will have a very pointed shape underneath and it looks like the Washington Monument. So easy way to tell them apart pretty much with all the crabs. On the bottom right is another swimming crab. It's a speckled swimming crab. The back leg is kind of up over the shell. This is just a molt that was on the beach. But you can see it has those modified paddles as well. And then the bottom left, we have our ghost crabs. Ghost crabs are really fun. They're called ghost crabs because they're kind of a yellowish white color. Oftentimes they're out at dawn or dusk or at night. And you may see their burrows on the beach. You'll see these little holes up near the dunes. And they have a front door and a back door. And what they will do is they will run down to the water to get their gills wet and then run back up the beach to their burrows. As long as they have their gills wet, they're able to breathe. So remember, these animals do have gills. They do not have lungs. So they do have to have a way to keep their gills moist in order to breathe. So ghost crabs are pretty fun little creatures to see running around the beaches. All right, now I'm sure that many of you have seen those down closer to where the water's coming in the swash zone. You've probably seen little, almost like little volcano structures that are surrounded by what looks like chocolate sprinkles. And I often am asked, what in the world are those chocolate sprinkles? Well, those are feces, my friends. Those are the feces of ghost shrimp. So we just talked about the ghost crabs that live further up the beach in the dune area. This, what you're seeing, is the burrow of a ghost shrimp. So there's a picture of the ghost shrimp on the bottom right-hand side. And I like to call these the rubber chickens of the shrimp world. And it's because they're kind of floppy. So they're very soft bodied. You don't often see them out of their burrows. Their burrows, I think, can get up to like 30 feet deep. So you can dig forever. You're never going to be able to dig up one of these ghost shrimp. But sometimes you will find them washed up on the beach. Um, we found one with our CMNA group this past spring, just randomly washed up at Beach Walker. I've seen them a couple times there, so that was a fun find. But those are the ghost shrimp that leave those little chocolate sprinkles all over the beach for us. Now, on the left-hand side, we have our barnacles, and oftentimes people don't realize that barnacles are crustaceans. So with a lot of these animals, they will start out as a swimming larva, and they will go through metamorphosis to look like what we see, as their adult form, what we recognize as their adult form. So the barnacles, when they're a swimming larva, look nothing like the adults. They're called anopleus. They have all these crazy little legs that, are swimming all around, and they go through metamorphosis. And when they transition into their adult phase, they actually form an adhesive on the top of their head. They will glue themselves down to a hard structure like the side of a dock. They will grow their calcareous shells around themselves, and then they will wave their feet out of the top of the shells. So they're basically on their head doing a handstand for the rest of their life, waving their legs into the water, and they are collecting plankton to eat. All right. Now, this is an arthropod, but it's not a crustacean, but I had to give a nod to the horseshoe crab here. It's a Chelicerate, subphylum Chelicerata. And that's because we do see these animals so often on our beaches, and they are so very important to us and to the environment in general. Um, Sometimes people are scared of horseshoe crabs because I guess they look a little bit scary. They look a little bit different. They've been on this earth a long time, since the Triassic. So they're, sometimes we tell people they're living dinosaurs. But that point that comes off the back of the shell is called the telson. It cannot stab you. It cannot sting you. It's merely a lever to help flip the animal over. So if the animal were upside down, what you're looking right now, you're looking at it top down. But if it were flipped around to the other side, you would see that its body parts would be exposed. So if it's upside down, it sticks its tail into the sand and acts as a lever to flip itself over. You may have heard that these animals, instead of having iron-based blood like us, they have copper-based blood, so they have blue blood. They're the true blue bloods of Charleston. And their blood has a special enzyme in it. It's called an amoebocyte, and it allows researchers to detect toxins in medications. So all of our vaccines are tested using horseshoe crab blood. If there were any what's called an endotoxin, or bad stuff, bacteria that was in the medication, a drop of the horseshoe crab blood would cause the toxins to like clot up. And so we would know that these medications are not safe for us to use. So they are collected in the Charleston area. There is a lab here that will then take their blood and then release them. Unfortunately, not all horseshoe crabs make it. And so there is now a synthetic that's being developed. So hopefully that will help their numbers to increase. They've also been used as fertilizer over the years, or like fishing bait. But if anybody saw the I guess it was the documentary that was recently put out about the red knots and the horseshoe crab. We have the red knots that migrate through the area, and they eat the horseshoe crab eggs. So they're super important for other reasons as well in the environment. All right, moving on to the cnidarians. So our jellyfish, that's a sea nettle. It's a type of jelly that we would find in our waters. And we have a variety of cnidarians that you would find. On the top left is an anemone. It's called a tricolor anemone. It's also called a hitchhiker anemone because sometimes you'll find it attached to like shells of crabs or other animals. And so it does have tentacles. We've actually just found one on one of my beach walks recently, so it was kind of fun. We just saw it rolling around in the surf, and it's just this little blob, but we were able to examine it for a few minutes. But they do have tentacles as well. On the bottom left-hand side, just kind of under the anemone, we have a moon jelly. The little clover pattern that you see on the top are the gonads for the moon jelly. If you come up from the moon jelly, you'll see a cannonball jellyfish, very common on our beaches in April. And what you'll see is another type of crab that I did not talk about. That's a spider crab or a decorator crab. And so oftentimes they'll hide out in the bell of the cannonball jellyfish. It's a commensal relationship. So it's a form of commensalism. So basically, the decorator crab will live with the jellyfish. It might steal food from the jellyfish. It might actually eat part of the jellyfish itself. The jellyfish doesn't really benefit in any way, but overall, the crab doesn't really bother the jellyfish. If you find one on the beach and you pick up the bell, you might see the little crab in there, and this crab will scuttle back into the water. It doesn't have to live with the jellyfish, but somehow, sometimes these, I think maybe in the larval form, they're just kind of sucked up into the bell of these cannonball jellyfish. These jellyfish are not going to have stinging cells that bother us. Sometimes they can cause a little bit of irritation on our skin, but these are the big leathery jellyfish that you'll find on the beaches. So if you pick them up by the top of their bell, they're really not going to bother you. That being said, on the very right-hand side of the screen is a Portuguese man of war. So that is definitely not something that you want to encounter on the beach. It's a siphonophore, which means that it's a whole colony of animals that actually lives together that functions as one. So it's a bunch of, they're called zooids that live together, and part of it makes like their sail, part of them make the stinging cells, part of them make the feeding cells of the animal. They're actually clones, so it's kind of a bizarre animal, but you definitely don't want to touch a Portuguese man of war. They're called that because they look like the old, I guess, Portuguese sailing ships. So, and then two more here. The picture on the left, there's a yellow and kind of a pinkish red variety. That's sea whip. So that's a type of soft coral that is commonly found on our beaches. If you were to look at it closely, you would see tiny little pinprick holes all along, the sides. That's where the individual coral polyps live. So again, this is a colony. When it's alive, it has a holdfast at the bottom, and it anchors itself down in the water. And then the coral polyps are able to wave their little legs into the water to collect plankton to eat. So sometimes we'll find the yellow form, sometimes it's orange, sometimes it's like a pinky purple. And then on the right-hand side, that strange little animal, again, something that I find at Beach Walker, is called a sea pansy. And it's a type of a soft coral. So it anchors itself down with that little stem called the peduncle. And when it's covered by water, it kind of expands in size. And it has just a whole bunch of little polyps on the top. And when the tide washes out, it kind of shrinks down a little bit in size. But it looks, I guess, like a little plant, which gives it its name, the sea pansy. But kind of a bizarre little fun find on the beaches. All right. And last, I'm going to talk about the worms. So phylum Annelida. Um, these are worm casings that are very common on our beaches. The top is from a plumed worm, and this worm will secrete a mucus, and it will attach little shells and other things to the mucus. In fact, I'm looking at it and I see a whole bunch of little coquina shells. I see part of an oyster. I see part of an arc shell all attached to the side of that tube there. And so the plume worm will live in its little burrow, and it will have, its fanning mouth parts that come out. When it washes onto the beach like that, it's likely, dead, and it's just part of that, the tube that's washed up onto the beach. On the bottom, we have what's called a parchment worm. And again, they almost look like trash on the beach, like straw wrappers have washed up onto the beach. And that is the parchment worm's casing. So it will secrete that paper-like material. It lives, kind of in a U shape under the sand. And, when it dies, sometimes you'll see part of that washed up onto the beach as well. All right, and I like to end with this. Obviously, these are not, animals that are alive on the beach with the exception of the sea turtle. But unfortunately, we do find a lot of trash on the beach. So I always encourage people, if you're on a beach walk, to please pick up your trash. Please never release balloons. Balloons just end up in the ocean. It's really the same thing as throwing a plastic bag into the water. I think this is an interesting picture because it says, "Here's to your future." And it's kind of grim if we think of it in this way. So it's our future of what a, a trashed ocean. But oftentimes animals will mistake plastic trash for food, like jellyfish. It will clog their guts and they won't live. So I always ask people to please pick up any trash that you find on the beach. And lastly, my images, I've realized I really do need to take a lot of my own photos when I'm out on the beach, but I had to sort through lots of images. So a lot of them were stock images from Dreams Time or various images that I found on iNaturalist. All right. Do we have any questions?
Yes, thank you so much, Andrea. If you do have questions, feel free to come off mute or you can put them in the chat and I can read them out for her. You're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat.
Okay, you know what? I think I just lost. Thank you all for being here. I think, okay, hold on. I think I may have just lost my, oh, there we go. Okay. Yes, I always love when people come on beach walks with me, because I just love beachcombing. I think it's, it's like a treasure hunt for me. And I have been doing these programs with the county parks this fall. I intend to keep doing them in the spring. And it's just so fun. So it's one of my favorite things to do. And I just, I'm always excited when people want to come on a beach walk with me.
Mhm.
You are talking to the right crowd. We do love our beach walks. I will say that video was pretty fascinating. I don't think I've ever seen a moon snail in action eating something else. That was wild. And also the fact that Native Americans were using the purple bluish interior shell for as bartering, that blows my mind too. I love that.
Yeah, very cool.
I have a question, Andrea. This is Nikki. Hi.
Yeah.
So when I'm walking on the beach and like, especially after a storm, sometimes there's a lot of sea stars or sand dollars that are definitely alive, or even lightning whelks or knob whelks that are alive. And my instinct is to pick them all up and to put them back in the water. So how long can they remain out of the water safely? Like, can they make it to the next tide coming in? Or should I be pushing them all back into the water?
I mean, you can, I always say if you want to throw stuff back in the water, feel free to do so. They can burrow into the sand. So they can generally burrow and try to, stay fairly moist that way, but they are intertidal animals, so they're kind of used to that as well. But sometimes, after a storm, you will see a lot of things tossed up on the beach. And, that's also a little bit of, there's some normality to that as well. Um, I have questions from people often where they say, why at certain times of the year do I find certain things? And sometimes there are just mass die-offs, and it could be, something at like a change in water temperature that's, natural for them. It could be a change in dissolved oxygen in the water. There's a million different reasons, or maybe there just was a storm, but generally they can rebury themselves.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about the jellyfish, the clear bubble. And I always I assume that the top is not going to sting me, but I don't know, so I don't touch it. Is it true that the top won't sting? And if I pick it up and it has that glob on the bottom, does that part sting?
So if you're talking about the cannonball jellyfish that have that really thick rubbery top, you don't have to worry about those stinging you. Sometimes they may cause a little bit of skin irritation on some people. If it's another type of jellyfish, I just always say be very careful. So
Yeah.
the tentacles will, come down from the middle of the bell, but you just don't know. You can have a tentacle that breaks off and washes up on the beach, and it has something called nematocysts in it, which are those stinging cells, and they can still fire. So I always say if you don't know what you're looking at, be very careful. But as far as the cannonball jellyfish, my kids will lob them at each other running down the beach, and I can always tell who's a tourist and who's not because the tourists are horrified by this. And I'm like, oh, they're good, don't worry about it. But yeah, cannonball jellyfish you generally don't have to worry about.
Okay, thank you.
I do have one question as well. Is there a field guide or a book that you
Yes.
recommend?
Yes, yes, yes. If you'll excuse me 1 minute, I meant to grab it. Let me get it.
You're totally fine. And I will say while she's grabbing that book, Nikki gave me a heads up. There are still some spots left for the walk and talk. She put the registration link in the chat, and then I know you sent it out via email as well. Okay, go
So
ahead.
this is a great one, Living Beaches. Hold on, my camera's there. Living Beaches. So this is a great one that I got with the CMNA program in the spring. So I don't know if it's something that's everybody has or not. But it's really fantastic. The only thing is that it's a little bit heavy. So there's another one here. It's South Carolina Beachcombers Guide. It's put out by SCDNR. And this one is nice because it's a lot lighter. It's easier to carry in your backpack. I will have both of these with me for the walk and talk. So you're welcome to flip through them if you come along and just tell me, see what you think of them. I do like them both. I mean, this one is a little more comprehensive with information, but this really does cover the basics.
Love that. Any more questions before I go ahead and mention a couple of upcoming events that we have? I will echo everyone's appreciation. Thank you so much for teaching us all about some beachcombing.
Absolutely. Thank you
I
for
know
having me.
even though we talk about some of this stuff in the Master Naturalist class, it's always like sometimes there's just so much cool stuff to learn about it. So I really appreciate all the information you shared today.
Absolutely.
I'll go ahead and stop recording, but stick around for just a minute.